The microphone man. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this business breakfast in partnership with Bloomberg. My name is Guy Johnson. I am one of Bloomberg's television anchors. As you can tell by my lack of Russian, I am based in London. So I'm going to be doing my bit in English, but our esteemed table of guests here at the center are going to be speaking in Russian. There is translation if you only speak English and you would like to hear the Russian, and if you haven't got one of the boxes, they are available at the entrance. So in terms of what we're going to be talking about this morning, we're going to be looking at the prospects for the Russian economy and the financial markets. So let's talk a little bit about the Russian economy. The Russian economy is probably, it's fair to say, growing below potential at the moment. I think we had 0.7 in the first 6 months of the year. I think we're probably going to grow at something like 1.3% by year end as government spending picks up. But that's below potential, and there are a number of kind of well-known factors behind this. The one that I spend most of my time talking about is the global trade war between the United States and China, which is reducing global demand, and that is fairly easily translated into the Russian economy via the price of oil and gas. Then we have weak consumer demand. Real wages have stagnated over the last few years. That is a factor. The Russian economy is 70% consumption, so that is something that we definitely need to talk about. Today in Abu Dhabi, we have the JMMC meeting taking place. Mr. Novak will be there. The caps that the OPEC Plus agreement have put into place is certainly a factor for the Russian economy and is having an impact in terms of investment by the hydrocarbon sector. You've got, related to the oil price, obviously, the fact that the Russian government is being very careful with the windfall that it gets from oil prices. Anything north of $40 a barrel is being saved into the wealth fund. So government spending isn't a factor that is kind of leaning against some of the weakness elsewhere. That's going to have an advantage. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And then foreign investment is, let's describe it as mixed. And there are a number of factors behind that. And again, we're going to discuss some of those. Corporate governance is one. That certainly appears to be improving. Rule of law is another factor that investors often talk to me about as well when it comes to the opportunity that is to be found in the Russian economy. Now, while the Russian economy is not growing at potential, now potential growth could be somewhere kind of around 1.5%, there are advantages to the restraint that the government has put in place. When it comes to fixed income, global investors are certainly continuing to search for yield, and the Russian bond market seems to present some good opportunities. The real yield here is very, very high, and that is very attractive for international investors. The Russian stock market, and I'm going to talk in year-to-date terms, which may be not kind of completely accurately portraying the situation, but let me just give you some figures for the Russian stock market so far this year. The MOEX has done 19% in ruble terms and 27% in dollar terms. I think it's one of the best performing stock markets in the world this year. However, it does trade at a significant discount to many of its global peers in terms of the multiple that it trades on. So we need to talk about why that is and what it is that global investors are concerned about when it comes to investing into Russia. The ruble has had a very good year thus far. If you look at it on a one-year basis, these numbers don't look quite so flattering. But so far this year, the ruble is the second best performing global currency behind the Thai baht. So the ruble has certainly picked up the pace this year, though on a one-year basis, the number looks a lot more flat. So I think what we should talk about this morning in certainly a reasonable amount of detail is how does Russia generate growth? The growth numbers at the moment clearly are insufficient. So what needs to happen for growth to pick up? Is it a cut in interest rates? Is it more government spending? Is it an improving global demand story? Is it more government spending? There are lots and lots of issues that I think we need to talk about and try and figure out some answers to, or at least get some insight into. So, for that to happen, we have a fantastic table of guests here at the center of the room. And the way we're going to operate is we're just going to have a kind of a conversation between ourselves, and we'll talk about some of the issues that I've raised thus far. We've got some other fantastic guests in the room here as well, and we'll bring them into the conversation. And then towards the end, I would like everybody to take part in the discussion and ask some questions. So there are going to be some roving microphones, which are going to be, well, roving around the room. And you'll be able to answer a question. So let me introduce our panel that we have, our breakfast panel, our late breakfast panel here in Moscow. We have Vladimir Kolychev, the Deputy Minister of Finance, Alexei Zabodkin, the Director of Monetary Policy at the Central Bank of Russia, Polina Kodyavko from Bloomberg. Nice to see you this morning. Polina's going to be doing this in Russian, so we're looking forward to that. I think she's really looking forward to that as well. And we have Alexander Branis, who's joining us from Prosperity Capital Management. Now, Bloomberg is mainly fixed income. Prosperity is mainly equities, so we've got both sides of the market covered there. And Mikhail Zadornov, the chairman of Trika, is going to be joining us as well. We might talk about consumer loans, so we'll maybe get onto that subject as well, which I know is very relevant in Russia at the moment. So let's kick things off. Vladimir, I'm going to ask you the first question. What needs to happen for Russian growth to pick up? What needs to take place? What is your kind of diagnosis of the situation, and what is your kind of expected path from here? Thank you.
Morning, everyone, and Guy, thank you so much for your question, and I thank everybody who joined us today for this breakfast discussion. The question is very pressing indeed. And since I'm the only person here who represents the government, I believe I will be the one who is responsible for explaining what the government does. So let us start with what we have today. How does it look for us? In the first 6 months, we saw a slowdown. Last year, the growth was 2%. In the first half of this year, it was 0.7%. So why did it happen? Why did the economy slow down? There are objective factors at play here. And last year, the government openly made this forecast, and it was discussed at the parliament when we discussed the budget. The main reason why it happened is the short-term adjustment to fiscal measures that the government accepted for a 6-year term. I'm speaking about financing priority national projects and funding these financial payments to this project. It is necessary. And so these various components of fiscal measures that we are carrying out, they are affecting the growth. Tax burden, growing tax burden immediately affected it. And of course, these national projects are all new, and we need time for them to become fully operational. And in this sense, there is no surprise here. The slowdown was no news. And of course, we cannot turn a blind eye to global economy and a slowdown of the global economy. For many, though, it was a surprise, the significant slowdown of global economy because of the crisis of 2008-2009. But that is the scenario that we had in mind from the very beginning. So what do we need to do? The main driver of our economic growth in our government program is private investment. And for that, we need good business climate, and we need to monitor how regulators and courts, our judiciary system influences our business climate. We work across all of these fields, and of course this work will soon yield results. And of course we cannot forget about the fact that we need better infrastructure in cities, and that is what we are doing now. We are increasing the quality of life of people in cities. We provide them with better education, with better public services, with better transport, with better health care. So we work with each and every one of these economic bottlenecks and day-to-day life bottlenecks. That is why we need our national projects to tackle those issues. And as soon as these national projects yield result, the economy will pick up. One thing that I would like to mention is that today we discuss what Russia should do and what the government should do in order to make our economy grow faster than the average. But I would like to give you some context, some background. Our growth pace, on average, they're not that different from the growth that countries with similar GDP per capita have. That is a widely known phenomenon, and economists like to call it average income trap. And that is where countries find themselves for the last 50 years, and only Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong have managed to get rid of this trap. Malaysia tries to do that. So the task that we face today is pretty ambitious. What have we been seeing during the last 2 years? The stability, the resilience of our economy is now very significant. We had 2 significant oil price shocks. For example, in autumn, the prices plummeted by 40%, and in spring by 20%. We had 2 rounds of foreign sanctions during these last 2 years. Global growth is slowing down, but our economy was pretty resilient. The inflation was under control, yes, the growth slowed down, but we do not speak about a recession. And we are now adjusting to this kind of a backdrop when these shocks, they do not affect the day-to-day life of economic agents, of our citizens. So what should we do? I would like to speak about what we shouldn't do. This resilience was made possible thanks to this microstructure that the government, together with the central bank, were building for the last several years. And we should not demolish this system through additional budget inflows or some extraordinary monetary decisions, because this stability, this resilience, it is a nice thing to get accustomed to, but we can easily lose it if we use tools that are too bold. Thank you. I do hope that I wasn't a bore. Thank you.
You set up the next question very nicely, which I'm going to ask to Alexei Zabodkin. We've just heard about stability. Interest rates have been coming down in Russia. We just saw another cut last week. We're at 7%. We are approaching the neutral zone, which is 6 to 7%. I guess the question a lot of people ask is, with inflation falling as sharply as it has done thus far, and that is a global phenomenon as well, like inflation around the world, it is certainly something that central banks are grappling with, not on the upside, but on the downside. How do you see interest rates developing from here? We have two more meetings this year. The expectation is, certainly from the governor, that we are going to see at least one cut. But given the delta on the rate of change on the inflation rate, why not have two? Why not get interest rates down at the front end more aggressively, and therefore have a more pronounced effect on the economy? Stability is certainly something that has been hard to come by, and inflation has come down and interest rates have come down very sharply. But why not at this point continue to push on that? Why not be a little bit more aggressive when it comes to interest rates?
Да, это действительно очень хороший вопрос.
Yes, this is a very good question. We think that we are quite aggressive. We had 3 cuts of the rates during the 3 meetings, and the final meeting of the board of directors confirmed its intention to consider the continuous declining of the rates. But of course, it depends. It will depend on the forecast. But now we also speak that we'll speak about modality, and we use this modality in autumn last year when we made some, increasing of rates because we had accelerating inflation. Now, speaking about this, why don't we want to be more aggressive, and why now? In our view, we don't have any basis to make it softer, not so aggressive. So Vladimir has already described the reasons why the growth has slowed down this year. And these reasons can be split into 2 parts. The first one is budget policy, and the second one, this is external sector and also slowing down of the international economy. But the factor linked with the budget policy is very temporal, because yes, we have the effect when we have an increase of non-oil taxes at the beginning of the year. Also, we had expenditure of the means through this channel, but also now we have acceleration only now. Also, we have accumulated some budget within the first 8 months. Of course, expenditure will be afterwards. It's about 700 billion of rubles. This is quite a good figure, and this is like 1% of GDP within 6 months. So 1% of growth, 0.7. This is like minus 1% because of the temporal not used budget, and then this will be like 1.5. This is the growth potential, and we know that this expenditure will be materialized. Of course, some will go to 2020. We hope that the government will not, use this non-used budget within this year. But this fact is temporal, and the central bank should not, of course, respond to this factor. Speaking about external demand factor, this is a more complicated issue. And I think that's quite a headache for all of us. And we don't always know what effects are temporal, what are not temporal in the international economy. And also, speaking about continuous change linked with deglobalization, it's also an interesting trend. And we are, as a central bank, also you can read the forecasts of the government. We also think that the sufficient part of slowing down of the international economy is continuous, is permanent. And if this is really permanent, the slowing down of the international economy, of course, it will increase on potential. In this sense, if we try to neutralize this with the help of the soft monetary policy, so this will lead to the creation of economy which will be overheated, and also inflation will grow up. And that's why, on the whole, now we think that so it will take 5 years. So 7% rate, as you remember, this was fixed on the 3rd of March of 2014, and it was announced like a temporal, increase of the rate. But now this time is going to an end, it seems, of this temporal increase. During this time, from the beginning of 2015 till now, the central bank were moving from tough policy, then to moderate tough policy. Now we are becoming more neutral. As the chairman said at the press conference, we can admit that the assessment of this neutral rate depends on the models which are used for this evaluation, and this is also linked with quite a wide interval of assessments. We heard also the opinions of investment society and academic society. They give us a wider interval for the neutral rate, and again, the main assessments, it's like writes 1-3 intervals. We can look at the publications of analysts, of academic magazines, also the latest reports of Monetary Fund, International Monetary Fund, and now we can understand that we are somewhere closer to this neutral zone, and this stability low inflation, it was won because of this quite harsh and modern harsh monetary policy within several years. And then when we had to decline inflation, of course, it was linked with some additional, restrictions of the economy. And our goal, we'll never have this goal, 4%. In America, Fed had 2 recessions within 3 years in a row, and only after this they could have this. But we managed to do this without the second recession, and I think this is a great accomplishment for us. And the inflation, declined even stronger in our country than in the USA in 70s, because there by the end of 70s it was getting closer to 5%, but we went from 12 till 4. That's why, once again, we can create risks, and of course we don't want to do this one more. And the same concerns the budget policy, because and also I would like to emphasize that consolidation of the budget, which happened from 2015 till 2018, and the additional consolidation also happened in the first half of the year. So this made up. If, again, we look at non-oil budget, oil gas budget, so in 2015 it was 10.5% of GDP. Now it's 5.5. So consolidation, you can see, is here. Yes, some part is linked to the inflation and nominal GDP because oil prices are now 60. And still we have here, again, we speak here about 4.4%. But, this is also our accomplishment, and this also restricted our growth. But now we are in the end of this journey, and we don't want, again, to repeat this journey, because the budget and monetary policy are there where it should be. Inflation is at the level of 4%, and also we had taken some structural measures. And the government also will accelerate all these things, and this will be like more natural trajectory. We don't know whether it will be really significant, but it depends on the situation of the international economy, on structural measures, and this is uncertainty, of course, uncertainty of the forecast. And also the other factor, which also will continue to restrict the growth, but it will happen maybe in 3 or 4 years. So this is demographic factor, because we have declining of a working force, and this will be like 0.5%, 1%, minus 1%, like each year, because we can see here decline of a working force, because now in 90s we had real problems with demography, and now we have a lot of pensioners, and when we really will see this trend, of course, this will happen. Thank you very much.
Alexei, thank you very much. Indeed. I should probably just point out to everybody, if they see these cameras around, that our event here this morning, our breakfast here this morning, is being live streamed on the Bloomberg terminal, so Bloomberg clients will be able to be watching this. I suspect there are probably a few other cameras here as well. So just to make clear to everybody, this is all on the record and others are watching. Just want to point that out.
Like these blue ones?
Yeah. Yeah.
Blue-eyed ones?
Alexa, you bring up the kind of the Volcker-like decline that we've seen in the Russian economy in terms of interest rates. That's a great opportunity.
In inflation, not in the economy.
Sorry, in inflation. In inflation, Volcker inflation. Yeah. And that's a great opportunity for me to bring in Paulina. Fixed income investors are very keen on yield at the moment, and Russia represents a good credit and a quite a chunky real yield. But that is partly because of what has happened in the Russian economy and the consolidation that we have seen, and the way that the budget has behaved, and what inflation has done. I guess the question to you is, how attractive is Russia right now, and how important, when fixed income investors look at Russia, is the growth story?
Спасибо.
Thank you very much. I will start with this. I can say that from the point of view of the foreign investors' investments in the bonds, if we speak about 70 countries in which we invest, Russia can be named as a dream of foreign investors in bonds, especially if we speak about bonds, in the national ruble currency. As you've said, Guy, considering where the international rates are and considering the indicators of Russia, I just can't even see any other single country which could be so attractive if we compare these two major factors. In my presentation, which we present to our investors, we compare Russia with other countries, and we show fiscal monetary indicators of Russia as, an ideal of quality to some extent in comparison with other countries, and not only in developing countries, but also developed countries. Also, the issue. So today we have been discussing this issue of growth. And if we speak about the factors which influence on growth in any country, not only in Russia, we can say that there are 5 major factors which are very important. The first one is growth of international economy. The second one, this is a demographic factor. The third one, this is political and geopolitical stability. Fourth, a desire to spend money. And then the fifth one, this is stimulus or possibility to spend money. Now let's look at these 5 factors. It's well known to everybody that the rates, the pace of the international growth now also is at a quite low level, and there are 2 main factors which will make it to continue the same way. The first factor, in the world we have much more debt than we wish it could be, and this debt volume also depends on potential future growth of the international economy. So till today, central banks try to solve this, problem through different methods, orthodox, non-orthodox. Now we want to move this problem to budget, from the central banks to budget, but the factors which could lead to more positive forecast, of the international economy, there are not so many of these factors. The second thing, this is a geopolitical issue. As you've said, this trade wars, which we have been discussing for a long time, and this dialogue, this discussion will continue for many months or maybe for years of these trade wars, because we have been discussing this dialogue between America, like an American artist and Chinese nationalist. And all these players, they are not interested in any compromise. And so a person who wrote this, the art of the compromise, is not really interested in this compromise. And but this is not the main driver. This is just only a factor. This is not the driver of the international market. Let's look at the demography. My colleague prepared the report, and I read it yesterday, speaking about demographic trends in the world.
And he compared demographies and population growth in the countries of the world today and in 80 years' time. If we look at what we have today, then Russia ranks 6th. If we look at what we will have in 80 years' time, then Russia will be on the 12th or on the 13th place with Pakistan. If we take a look at those countries who lead the pack in terms of demographics, these are Asian countries, India, first of all, and African countries. Normally, when we discuss demography, we speak about it as a long-term phenomenon, but it is very important for our short-term considerations. One of the reasons why India continues growing at a 7% rate, it is because of some demographic factors. Next point that I would like to touch upon is political stability. And we see here a downward trend. Geopolitical stability is yet another interesting factor to consider, and we can have a very detailed discussion on sanctions. But I believe the true question here is whether more soft sanctions will help Russian economy and its growth. And to me, the question is still open, considering the first thing that we discussed. And the last two factors is preparedness to spend money, desire to spend money. I believe Russian people are willing to spend. And if we compare Russia and China, I was in Beijing a month ago, and we were talking with some Chinese officials. And one of the most pressing issues that we discussed was how to control the expectations of a 30-year-old Chinese who never experienced what a crisis was and was always supported by his or her parents. So the desire to spend money that these 30-year-old Chinese have is on the rise. In Russia, the situation is different. We go through crisis quite often, and we have this opportunity to focus on survival issues. We are more accustomed to it here in Russia. It is more pronounced here in the Russian economy than it is in other countries. And of course, stimulus is another important factor to be considered. There's stimulus, this motivation to grow. There is a lot of money. The question is how fast it can be spent. And if I refer to what Alexei and Vladimir said, I would say the following. There is a lot of money, but the desire to spend it fastly is pretty low because of obvious reasons. So if you look at the totality of these factors, I believe that Russian economy will not grow faster than the global average. Probably it will happen because the global average will become lower. Thank you.
A desire for the Russian economy to exceed the global average, amongst other things he laid out, and certainly having more children and the demography story is in there as well. I want to talk about the international equity investor and the kind of the perception in just a moment, but I just want to pick up on what Paulina was saying about the desire to spend. Mikhail, you're probably an obvious person to talk to about this. Let's hand that one over. We have seen a pickup in consumer lending in Russia. I think it's been running at circa 25%. The central bank is going to be imposing some more strict regulatory requirements.
Now 22.
22. I apologize. And we are going to see some restrictions coming in, which is going to limit unsecured consumer borrowing, the types of people that can, and there are going to be more clearly defined rules when it comes to official income. So that's likely to have an effect. So I think that comes into place in October. The consumer is, as we've just heard, not spending money. The consumption is 50% of the economy. Can I just ask you very quickly, because I think this will feed back into the economic numbers. When new rules come in on consumer lending, how fast do you think that consumer lending will drop? I'm just kind of curious as to the quantum of kind of money that you are lending and the sector is lending at the moment, and what that quantum will look like after these new rules come in.
Спасибо за вопрос. Он действительно последний.
Thank you for this question. Indeed, this question has been discussed very widely by economists. For the last 3 years, the growth of consumer lending, unsecured consumer lending, was at the level of 20–25%. Since May, there was a slowdown. I believe in this year the level of consumer lending will be at 20%. And in October, we'll have a more strict regulation on consumer lending. And that will, of course, influence banking policies. But I wouldn't say that this influence will be so crucial. There won't be a significant immediate slowdown, because until these new regulations are in place, the banks will try to issue as more loans as they can. And secondly, from the point of view of returns, if we speak about lending of small enterprises, corporate lending, and retail lending, consumer lending, these measures will account for 2 to 3% on the capital. But if we speak about consumer lending, it will be the most profitable out of all other types of lending. And in the future, it would be all about the capital. Who of the banks will have enough capital to continue this lending, taking into account new measures that will be in place starting with October? And I believe that next year, we'll see the slowdown in the growth of consumer lending portfolio of up to 10%. That is our forecast. Of course, we won't be seeing a sharper slowdown, but we will have this 10% slowdown. And let me just highlight that overall, consumer lending is growing by 2% per year, and consumer spending is growing by 2% per year. And that is a pretty moderate pace, and consumer lending keeps it at this level. And a significant slowdown isn't something that we want to see, because we do not to see consumer spending going down to zero. Because if you look at the GDP spending accounts for 60% of the GDP, and that means that the economic growth is closely tied to it. And if we have a broader picture, and if we ask ourselves, why do banks do that? Because there is a demand. In 2015, in 2017, there wasn't as much consumer lending. The growth of corporate loans was at a 0 rate in the first 6 months, and we believe it will grow by 5, or in the best case scenario 7%. I believe it will be at 5%. In 16 and 17, we saw a 0 growth of corporate lending. So what we see is that there is no demand for other types of loans apart from consumer lending. That is why banks are following the demand. They try to respond to this demand, which lies in the field of consumer lending. That is absolutely obvious today for our banking system. And probably I would like to make two comments on what our previous speakers said. Vladimir Kolychev said that Russia finds itself in this average income trap. If we look at the current prices at income per capita, and even if we look at purchasing power, it is something at what the monetary fund looks. We now are not even in top 50 countries on purchasing power parity. And if we look at Central Europe, for example, at what has been happening in the last 3 years, then we will see that Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary had their growth at the level of 4 or 4.5%. Even Romania has been growing at the pace of 3.5%. And if you go to Warsaw, Krakow, or Prague, you will see the manifestations of this growth with your own eyes, because you'll see those changes in infrastructure. 3.5 million Ukrainians do not go in Russia now for work, but they go to Poland. And that is also a question of demographics. We have 3.5 million Ukrainians working in Poland. And of course, these countries will also see a slowdown in their growth, because they are very much oriented towards exporting to Germany and to other European countries. Still, for us, that is an example to consider and to analyze, because our countries are comparable in terms of income per capita, in terms of the quality of life. And we see how they behave, how they grow against the similar backdrop. I'm sorry I continue speaking, but I would like to get back to the very beginning of discussion. I was hoping that we will see budget funding to national projects by the end of 2019. Last year, we visited Russian Far East with my team because of the Eastern Economic Forum. We visited the cities, and what we saw is that this whole national projects architecture, they will receive their funding by the middle of 2020 in the base case scenario. Unfortunately, that is what we see. The funding is not coming as fast as we thought it would. And that is how federal funding influences on the economy. And year by year, our federal budget finances 20–25% of all of the investments. That is why we we'll have to wait for this inflow into our budget. Thank you.
But I'm going to just kind of pause because I think Mikhail's raised some interesting question, which I think we should put back to Vladimir. Two things come out of what Mikhail has just said. One of which is the consumer is really important. It's a really important part of the Russian economy. Consumption is a big part of the Russian economy, and yet we see real income stagnating. And maybe to get the machine kind of spinning a little bit faster, we need to find a way of allowing consumers, maybe not via unsecured lending, but by kind of real wage increases, to actually start to play a bigger part in the economy, because they're not right now. You look at the retailers, and we'll talk about kind of what the equity story looks like in a moment. The picture I see from them is reasonably depressed. So we need to get the consumer going. And the second point that Mikhail brings up is can we not bring forward some of this spending? Can we not make it happen a little bit faster? Shovel-ready projects, as they're known in the United States, are hard to come by. But nevertheless, is there a way of starting that a little earlier and a little bit more aggressively?
Да, спасибо. По поводу...
Thank you for the question. Speaking about consumer expenditure and also income, speaking objectively about this, here this is like chicken and egg issue, because if economy is growing, also wages are growing, and also a fundamental expenditure, consumer spending is growing also. And if we use artificial measures, it will never work. And it will be very difficult to do this work. It can be quite a strange idea. So it should be more natural. And if we look at wage growth, yes, wages are growing than in our economy than GDP. And that's why here we can take some measures to redistribute the incomes between the incomes of the companies and population. Maybe it's also not so fair for us in this case. Speaking about the government, what does the government do here? They care more now about more vulnerable people. The elderly people. This was one of the reasons of this pension reform, because so the government wanted to increase the pension of the elderly, to make some kind of indexation of this pension, and also there are some target categories where we can see poverty risks. These are families with many kids, with many children. Here also there are some benefits, allowances were introduced through this reform, and also so new families which have just newborn kids, where some spouse, wife or husband can't work, and also the government tries to take care about such vulnerable families as well. And speaking about spending, consumer spending, of course, here investments will fluctuate, and on the basis of this in this investment growth, the economy will be accelerated, and also the wages will catch up, I think, and the income will catch up with this. Maybe here we should, so the egg again should not be ahead of the chicken here. And speaking about the budget spending, the budget expenditure. So there are two main things. Maybe they are quite technical, but I would like to explain them. The first one is that the budget policy since this year has become more stimulating. As Alexei has said, so within the last 4 years, we had unprecedented for us and also for many countries, we had a consolidation of the budget, 4% of GDP, structured consolidation of the budget. Not many countries managed to do this successfully. Successfully, I mean that they did not have to play this back, And since this year, we increase the structural deficit of the budget by 0.45% of GDP. That's why we lend more this year to finance new programs on spending. Should we, and is it possible to spend quicker? This is quite an ambiguous issue, because when we see new projects, here we have always to set up these new projects. For example, the project on loans and on increase of availability of loans for, small and middle business. Now we can see, so for this small, medium business to be more active, we need to set up this program right, properly. And this situation exists in many new spending programs. For example, capital expenditure of the budget. Here it will be more efficient to measure 10 times, to choose what precisely we need to build to a structure, so then to invest too much money into the structure, and then we can find out that there are some problems and the infrastructure maybe is not needed for people. Look at the Soviet Union. This is our last example. We started to build a lot of infrastructure, and now we have so many, infrastructure unfinished. Again, to delete this infrastructure, again, we have to pour here a lot of resources and money. That's why maybe it's important not to spend quicker and to report, yes, we spend this money, that's all. But maybe it's more important to achieve a good result, and this is more important for us now. And so construction. I think that the situation in regions can be different. In Far East, we have one situation. In the Central region, we have another situation, because here we have some projects which are existing already now. And now, step by step, maybe in the second quarter of this year or maybe next year, we'll have the spending rates on some priority programs which we introduced in the beginning. Thank you very much.
I guess is exactly. Alexander, I've got a bunch of questions that I'd like to ask you, but I guess the one I'm going to kick off with is a fairly straightforward one. The Russian equity market is doing well in percentage terms. The numbers look fantastic. Once you start to dig a little bit deeper, you see the multiples on which the market trades are not commensurate with what you would expect in other similar markets around the world. Why is that? What is it about Russia that is creating this discount to others? Is it the growth rate? Is it lack of opportunities? Is it corporate governance? Is it concerns amongst international investors about the rule of law? Michael Calvi is a name that I hear a lot when it comes to the Russian situation. What is it that investors are, both domestic and foreign, are concerned about here, and why does the market trade at a discount, and what can be done about it? Lots of questions.
Thank you very much. Here I'm the only one, Alexander, at this table. This is quite a seldom case in Russia, but this is quite pleasant. And I hope that you also have evaluated my patience. But here I'm the last one in this discussion, because you can also here respond to previous presentations. Paulina said that Russian bond market is a dream for investors. But here, speaking about share market, maybe I just even lack of words. Even this is like even a dream which is even bigger. So speaking about Russia, what is wrong with Russia? Here, you always want to rationalize this current situation and to find some fundamental explanations why Russian companies are traded at the levels which are, lower, like by twice than at the other markets. But here, the perception is reality, we can use here this saying. So investors, how they respond to this markets, this is becoming reality. It doesn't matter whether they are right or wrong. We attract money to Russia of international investors, and here we face such things which can be quite which are stereotypes. So maybe earlier they were real, but now not so many people who are busy with investments globally. Yes, of course, they have a lot of countries to deal with, and Russia is only one of the countries, and they maybe don't think too much to understand what is happening here. Investors to whom we appeal, sometimes they have quite old-fashioned perceptions about Russia, that here it's quite difficult to receive income for investors of capital companies, and always we can say that the glass is half empty or half full, but in my view, Russia is not so different from many other developing countries, China or Turkey. And speaking about these issues which were raised, the rule of law, predictability, what is happening. Yes, here from time to time, we can see here some unexpected, not pleasant things, but I believe that now we don't have so many of them. But the same happens at the other markets. But investors, nevertheless, ready to pay more multiplicators for companies there than in Russia. So here, maybe there's quite a negative perception of Russia, because there are some, of course, certain cases quite negative which have been existed in Russia, but it disrupt trust of Russia. But because of some individual cases, not of the whole situation, and there is no any objective explanation. Maybe 10, 12 years ago, we had more problems and we had more bad cases in Russia. It was more complicated to work, but nevertheless, there was some optimism, and now the situation is much better, but now nobody believes that it's true, and they don't consider these positive things which we have achieved here. Speaking about Russian entrepreneurs, unfortunately, the same situation is here. Speaking about the reason of low growth, this is maybe, business confidence, lack of business confidence that they have to invest. And we can see so that companies are very, careful here about new projects, about investments, because they have high dividend payments. And if we look at, that market where this income is like quite low, sometimes here in our companies we have quite high dividends. But here so the other side here is low investments and not so many projects which this companies launch. And of course, the situation as what happened with Vostok and how it happened, it has quite a negative impact. But, at some other markets, there also some such cases can happen, but it should not be here. I hope that then this will change. But, Russia, yes, is unique with its discount, but it's not unique because of this certain cases. And these cases are characteristics for developing markets, emerging markets. But also here we can see improvements, good improvements during last years, speaking infrastructure, corporate management, also good, reasonable approach of state companies towards business, because these companies, state companies, they just digested the money which they earned. They So they send them to investments, which were mentioned by the previous speaker. And now these companies also have good stimulus from the point of view of owners who are looking forward to dividends. In this case, they look at the structure of capital, at their income, and the companies start to work, in accordance with the market needs. Speaking about the future, this negative, attitude towards Russia is linked with the geopolitics and with some tension, here, which exists, which has happened during last years. But here we can see that we have a new dialogue with Ukraine, and this is quite optimistic because I think this also caused some, negative things about Russia. And here we can see the effect of low basics. I disagree with Paulina, speaking about political stability. It seems to me that many investors think that Russia is quite a simple political system where in the Kremlin we have a dictator who makes all solutions, but vice versa. So they should be more positive because within last years there are many defects of this process, but we can see more competitive political process and the higher activity of opposition.
So we see that the situation here is improving in the political field, and that will later on reflect on the perception of Russia as a market. Speaking about rates and macroeconomic policies, I too believe that the combination of proxy budget and high interest rates is a very destructive combination as of now, because now we see that many central banks have pivoted towards cutting interest rates, though it seems you cannot cut them, you cannot decrease them anymore. But still, so if we separate VAT effects, then inflation is lower than the target of the central bank. So we believe there is some potential to work with there, some potential for market improvement. Alexei has actually spoken about this already. Thank you.
Я хочу сказать не про ставки.
I won't be speaking about interest rates now, just a couple of figures on investment. And there is one important remark that I would like to make. Now on to investment. A nice way to test investment attractiveness of a country is foreign direct investment. FDI doesn't depend on a country's monetary policy because they're financed through global markets. So whether your monetary policy is soft or it is strict, it has nothing to do with FDIs. And figures here are pretty transparent. Until 2012, there were some spirals, of course, but still, if we look on the average, then they were around $10 billion per quarter. If we look at what we've been seeing, the sum that we have in the last 4 quarters, then we will also have $10 billion. And by the way, the size of the GDP hasn't been decreasing in nominal terms. So we see that the intensity of FDIs has fallen by 4 times. Now, there is this view that the main way to finance investment is credit, is lending. But that is actually just an additional way of financing. The main way to finance your investment is your capital, is your own capital. So if you are willing to risk your own capital, to invest your own money, and to risk it to carry out some projects, to roll out some projects, you should do that. Yes, if you have loans, you will have better return on investment. But there are some risks here, because the more leverage you have, the greater risk you are running of losing your money if something happens on the market, because your leverage is getting you better yield, but also makes you run greater risks. So the preparedness of foreign investors to invest into equity capital here in Russia has plummeted 4 times, by 4 times. It is now 4-fold as low as it used to be. So now those enterprises who are trying to bridge some gaps in their balance will get their loans, or to compensate for the ineffectiveness of their business models. So first, we should create conducive environment for investment in equity capital. And after that, we should work with lending. And if we look at what enterprises have, then they will tell you that the accessibility of loans is pretty much at the same level, because we have such official surveys. And now we see that companies are paying more dividends. What does it mean? That companies are not ready to reinvest their own income because they do not see any prospect of development. Thank you. And that is why they're paying greater dividends.
How do we persuade companies, how do we persuade corporate leaders to invest in their business? How do we persuade them to invest in people? How do we persuade them to invest in kit, in capital expenditure? How do we persuade domestic investors to do this, and how do we persuade foreign investors to do this? Vladimir.
Мы над этим вопросом.
I believe there were so many heated discussions over this topic. I would like to comment on what Alexei has said. Of course, FDIs have dropped, but the question is to what extent they're foreign, because around 80 or 90% of what we denominate as foreign investments are, in the end, our domestic investors who invest using some offshore structures. That is what our major businessmen would often do. Of course, it doesn't mean that it is wrong when we said that these major companies do not invest, but they're trying to use various mechanisms such as dividends to deal with their income. But it doesn't really reflect the way real foreign investors perceive business climate in Russia. I should say that we should not make our central bank deal with stimulating the growth. I believe that is not something that Bank of Russia does. The bank should ensure stability, and they should figure out what kind of rate will ensure such stability. All of the restrictions that we have today in terms of investments that stand in the way of major investors or of the small investors, we should work with these restrictions to lift them. One of the famous politicians used to say that the government, the state, shouldn't just stand in the way and investment will come. I believe we now moved to the next level, where the state shouldn't simply not stand in the way, but it should also try and lift all of the restrictions. But that is a lot of work. That has to do with working with regulators, with working with loan accessibility, working with SMEs, and providing some tax stimuli. And the government is working in all of these directions, and we believe that this work will prove fruitful. But in order to turn this negative narrative on a dime, we should really work, because unless we do something, we won't change the situation. Back in 2014, 2015, we said that the inflation will at the level of 4%, by the budget is balanced to 40%. It was causing so much laughter. Now nobody is laughing. Everybody has to put up with it. So in a couple of years, I believe everybody will put up with the fact that you can invest in Russia and you will have a significant yield, because Russia is very attractive, especially across some of the sectors. Thank you. May I please chip in on this issue of how we can attract foreign investors? There are some factors that we should consider. We have already discussed sanctions and the rule of law, rights of ownership of property that should always be considered. But there are some other factors, soft factors I would call them, that play a big part. In English, we say talk is cheap. I believe when we speak about investment, this saying is wrong, because when I come to think about cases and examples of companies and countries that attract a lot of investment despite their structural problems, the talk is not cheap at all. Let me draw the example of Argentina. I do not know a single investor who came to these countries and wouldn't be satisfied by the way this investor is welcomed, by how accessible the government is. And that is something that hasn't changed in Argentina for the last 20 years. But still, its sovereign debt brings them 37 cents per dollar, and Argentina is facing the risk of restructuralization. And if we look at Russia, then probably we have this reverse trend to what we see in Argentina. I was meeting with some of the state-owned companies, and one of the meetings was pretty memorable. We bought bonds from a state-owned company, and this company was pretty upset about the fact that we wanted to meet them after we purchased their bonds. And the first question that I got at this meeting: did you buy our bonds? Yes. Why asking questions now? All of the questions that you had, you should have asked them before purchasing our bonds. Now, it doesn't make any sense for me to answer your questions. Of course, it is not as extreme today, and now the situation has significantly improved. But if we say that Russian companies give the same talk that foreign investors are willing to hear from them, it is premature to say that. And we can achieve and accomplish a lot if we are more polite and if we are show more hospitality towards our investors. Thank you. I'm ready to share two measures that are on our short list that could help us to attract investors. So first thing we could do is mandatory offer. So in this case, shareholders have an opportunity to sell their shares to a company that purchased more than 30% of the overall portfolio, because there are risks of a changing strategy, and that is something that is available on all the markets. In Russia, we have that set forth in our legislation, but it doesn't really work, or it works at someone's desire. That is something that can be easily done. We just need political will to do that and to change the very procedure to make it possible in any scenario that will make investors more certain. And the second thing we could do is quasi-treasury bills. quasi-treasury shares. That means that shares that are on the balance of the company, they should not be voting. What I'm saying is that the management should have an opportunity to play the role of the owner, using shares that have been purchased using money of all of the shareholders. In Russia, again, we have that set forth in our laws, and this type of shares cannot be voting shares. But if this company has a 100% daughter company, they can do that actually. And we have these examples when a company has no restrictions as far as the voting is concerned or dividend payment is concerned. And that affects the decision-making process in the companies and really turns the whole thing upside down. So I believe if we tackle these two issues, it would have a very significant effect on the way investors perceive our country. And these two measures has been discussed for a lot of years, but unfortunately, we're still deadlocked here.
Basically protecting minority shareholders, and that is pivotal if people are to be investing. Mikhail, any solutions from your point of view on how we encourage investment, how we particularly encourage foreign investment, but domestic investment as well?
Ну, я, честно говоря, думаю, что если будут...
I believe that if we have domestic investors, then foreign investors will join in later on. Because everybody looks at what happens on our domestic market if they want to invest. And from this point of view, we have been seeing some progress. As you all know, now together with decreasing deposit interest rates denominated in rubles, now we also see a very fast growth of the number of investors who open their own brokerage accounts and start to invest. These are individual investors. We had this very mixed experience of offering insurance products such as life insurance, and the market was at $250 million, which is quite significant for Russia. Now, as banks were selling structural products, starting with very wealthy clients and on to affluent segment, upper affluent segment, that is upper middle class.
And, within the last 1 year and 1.5 years, this product is becoming more and more popular, and it makes quite a serious domestic demand. But at the same time, you also should have tools, infrastructure to propose also some things to these investors, and also you should have quite a big market, bonds and shares where people could invest and which people could invest. And at this stage, it's quite dangerous, to be positive, not to be positive. It's important not to cheat people, because if they face some negative trends, again, this movement can slow down and it will not develop further. These investments, as I can see, are so these trends are quite positive. And secondly, I can agree with Alexei. Yes, there is money in Russia. If we look again at the bank statistics, I can say that growth of finances within this year 7-8% in foreign currency and in rubles. This exceeds some kind of historical share, which was okay for the enterprises last 10 years, for example. And also, we spoke about the budget and the current budget policy. I can say that the money of the state is already 16% from the total volume of the means of legal entities at the bank accounts. So now the state can't spend this money, so it doesn't spend this money. But there is money, and here we speak about investors, enterprises, whether they really want to invest this money into some projects. Again, chicken or egg, if everybody understands that the economic growth is 1%, so accordingly there will no be consumption higher of woods or some croissants and so on. Why should you invest into these goods if you have this feeling that there will no be any economic growth, no consumption growth? Here quite a distinct interconnection between these things. Entrepreneurs should feel that some spheres will grow, and not only 1-2%, but they will grow at a more significant rate, and there can be some new niche, some new areas, or again demand. In this case, there will be investments.
Thank you very much indeed. There has to be a chicken or an egg, I guess, is we need one or the other. I feel we're just getting going. These kind of things always kind of start to pick up the pace, and it starts to get quite exciting. We are beginning to run out a little bit of time, and I'm very keen that everybody gets to play a little bit of a part. Everybody hopefully has enjoyed their breakfast at this point, so they'll be able to join in the conversation. We've also got with us today Aneta Kirby, who I think is the new IMF resident here in Russia. And I'm curious to get your take. Let me try and see if we can find you a microphone. She's over there. Thank you very much indeed, Alexei. Your take on A, our discussion, and B, kind of what you see as being the kind of the opportunities and the challenges here in Russia.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you to the presenters for your very insightful thoughts. Guy, you've asked me a good question, I think, just in terms to highlight from a big picture what we see Russian prospects are. So following the recession in 2015, Russia has cemented macroeconomic stability. The inflation targeting regime has been key, but also the fiscal rule in terms of not only insulating the economy from volatile oil prices, but also preserving a competitive exchange rate. And I think, or we think, this opportunity should not be squandered. This is a challenge going forward for the Russian authorities to implement deep-seated structural reform. I think all of the presenters touched on all of these issues, so I'm going to be brief and just kind of outline from the IMF's view what our kind of broad recommendations on this has been. And first, we see the need for improvement in competition in the environment, including in public procurement. This would allow the private sector to participate more actively in the economy. Second, and perhaps this is a pie-in-the-sky dream given the global environment, but it would be good for Russia to be more globally integrated across other markets. This would help non-energy exports, diversification of the economy. And finally, you've all touched on this, there should be, and we hope there will be, improvements in the business climate. And there's a long laundry list, so I won't get into that in any detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's certainly a subject, the latter one, that comes up time and time and again in the discussions that I have. Look, I'm sure there are some fantastic questions in this room. We've touched on many of the subjects that I think are relevant for the Russian economy. I'm aware that time is running out, but I'm going to squeeze a little bit more time here, just to make sure we get some questions in. So we've got some roving microphones, or you can have mine, to be honest. If you'd like to put up your hand, I will happily let you jump in. And if you could just say kind of who you are and where you're from, that would give us at least some context on where the question is being generated from. So any questions? Gentleman over there. Sorry, we just wait. Microphone. Perfect. Thank you.
Спасибо рейтингу.
Thank you very much, rating agency. So the question to College of Vladimir here, there were quite a lot of factors mentioned which influence on economic growth, and of course I can't but agree. But I can ask one more question. What about Vladimir? How do you think, and our government, maybe so the key factor of Russian Federation is one key question. So the government person is in charge of our economy. This is an official, the head of the state company, the judge, but this is a state person. He will never take risks. He manages, he controls, he regulates, and this is good. But he never risks practically. Maybe, how do you think? Maybe there should be an entrepreneur in charge, and it will be linked with the investment climate, with the entrepreneur demand. Mikhail Mikhailovich spoke about this. Maybe we should not tackle about problems, speak about problems all the time, but maybe we should have some other representatives here. Thank you very much. What do you mean? What a person is here in charge? Maybe can you say his name and this who is in charge, who decides everything? I can't understand this. Okay, but this is an official, a judge, also the head of the state company, a state person, a state man, the person who never risks, but he gets a fixed wage. But how can he influence on investments, for example, on Yandex company or metal companies? I can't understand this. But this is a key issue. If you can't understand it, so one more example. 4 years ago, when I was at the meeting in the central bank, I spoke about the foreign currency regulation. We had some prescriptions from the central bank, and it was said there that you violated this and this. But then we asked, what did we violate? What documents did we violate? And they said that we'll have this regulation adopted only in 3 months, and then you will understand. But now you have to be in compliance, even before this regulation. Yes, I understood, and I've got your question. But I think these problems. So now you say that the officials who are discussing problems at the conference, officials who are discussing some problems here, so you want them to solve your cases, specific cases. But here it's a little different. What do you want to hear from me? Maybe it concerns not us, but some kind of regulating activities. I can add. So who is in charge of our economy? If we can take it seriously, 2-3 years ago, approximately, we had some disinformation, some so-called fake news. So fast mentioned one figure, but it did not have any references, any sources. It was really a fake news. But they said that 70% or 60% of Russian economy is under the government control. And then it was spread, this rumor was spread, then the figure increased. It was 80% already. And it was like mass hysteria after this fake news. And since then, some additional calculations, research were conducted, and the International Monetary Fund just recently also conducted calculations which showed that in accordance with different methods till 43%. So the rest, this is private sector, and only this is the government sector. So yes, earlier we had mass privatization, and since then private sector has been always increasing, and it has been growing faster than the government sector. So, and I would like to emphasize this. Maybe it can a private entrepreneur is in charge of our economy. Maybe, of course, they are not so big like Gazprom or Rosneft, but collectively, these people, these entrepreneurs, they really influence on our economy. They can slow down growth or increase growth. This is their solution now, not solution of any judge or the government people.
Any other questions? I'm aware that time is... I'm going to stand up in case. Let me just see if I can see one. Nobody else got any other? I missed one. This gentleman here. Thank you very much. If you could just say where you're coming from, that would be fantastic.
Добрый день, коллеги.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Gazprom Bank. I have a question to Alexei, because he set an example of an American economy. It's a classical example of high inflation and then targeting. But American economy since 80s, 90s was not in the state of the budget consolidation, but in the quite soft budget. And the sovereign debt was 30% at that time. And then at the exit, the sovereign bond was 60% from GDP. How do you think, so considering this current situation, maybe we are too tough towards the budget? Maybe we are now in the mode of such double, strengthening, and it can lead to this, that it will be difficult to come back to growth expectations. Yes, this is a very good statement and a good question. I think we have already mentioned this in our discussion. And yes, within last 4 years, there was significant consolidation, at the budget side, and some kind of recalibration of monetary policy. And thanks to this simultaneous movement, we managed to decline inflation quicker than in the USA in 80s. And I would like to emphasize my message of this discussion, that this process is over. And, from here, so this monetary, credit policy is already in the neutral zone. And the budget policy, after this, shifting, from the first quarter, linked with the delay of the start of the launching of large national projects, maybe also it will be postponed by 1 or 2 quarters. But on the whole, this budget policy will move to the mode that it will be, moderate and stimulating. This is already a peek into the, into the past, here we don't want to repeat again this story. We don't want to repeat this. That's why on the basis of this stability, macroeconomic stability and key macroeconomic parameters which we have already achieved, from this we'll move on and we'll increase our growth rates. But within last 4 years, our growth rates were a little bit slowed down because of this. And I can also say that the American economy in 80s and the USA as a country never faced those so many external challenges as we face. That's why accelerated consolidation for us was very good here.
May I please jump in? Probably that is what I heard from your question. Probably that is what you actually meant. But I believe your message was as follows. It seems like we've been putting too much pressure, that our policies now are too strict. But if we look at a 4-year period, then you'll see that we have been working together with the central bank. Even when it was time to put a lot of pressure on our monetary policy, the budget was not consolidating. The consolidation in 2015 was not that significant. And when the central bank, when it saw that the inflation expectations were getting lower, it started to carry out this neutral policy. We were acting more dynamically as far as consolidating processes were concerned. So today, when we're speaking about our budget policy as a policy, not as some technical issue, not speaking about the fact that some banks cannot get money to their clients who participate in export projects. That is a technical issue, not a policy issue. But our budget policy, starting from the beginning of this year, it is a stimulating policy. Thank you. And going back to our monetary policy, the way to measure how efficient our monetary policy is the inflation level. And while we were talking, I asked my colleagues to calculate it. So from the moment when the inflation got to the level of 4.3%, it was at this level in August. In March 2017, starting March 2017 to the current moment, the average inflation in annual terms, we will see that the inflation was at the level of 3.7%. I believe it is very close to the target. And that is something that we tried to achieve, and we did that. And that is why I believe in the foreseeable future, as far as our monetary policy is concerned, is to maintain this accomplishment.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think time has finally beaten us. So I'm going to wrap things up here. I hope you've enjoyed your breakfast. That's the first thing. But I really hope you've enjoyed our discussion here. And I hope you've got lots of things that you can take away from it. So it is just left to me to thank our fantastic panel for being with us today and answering so many questions and having such a lively debate. Thank you very much indeed.